My name is Nick Pechenin. I'm lead systems designer. The team of systems designers works on the RPG core rule set. So that means all of the math, all of the roles, all of the bonuses, stats, attributes, etc.
What is your best D&D advice and best Baldur's Gate 3 advice, which they're virtually the same thing in terms of each of the classes? And what's your favorite thing about some of the subclasses included? Let's delve into Barbarian.
For Barbarian, the advice is very simple. It's don't hold back, right? Rage turn 1, rush into the center of a battle. You're probably going to survive it. It's probably going to be epic. If not, it's still going to be epic, something to tell people about. If you like chaos, we have Wild Magic Barbarian subclass for you. So this is like chaos squared. Barbarians are already really good at just like rushing into the middle of everything and throwing all caution to the wind. And then now, if you're Wild Magic Barbarian, you raging can also trigger these magical surges that will create new opportunities or threats.
There is, and this is one example, you created Wildheart, which is a subclass that you designed specifically for the game.
Wildheart is very much based on a book subclass, but we did some tweaks that made sense for this campaign. We wanted to make sure that Barbarian, who is attaining these beast spirit powers, that they had still flexibility. So we know that the campaign is huge, and maybe you really like wolves, and then 20 hours later, you don't like wolves anymore. Now you like monkeys. As a barbarian, it's absolutely normal to change your mind. Nobody expects you to stick with just one wild heart, one beast spirit. So we really wanted for players to experiment.
And the Berserker subclass under Barbarian is also the very kind of quintessential Barbarian. It's the most barbarian, right?
Yeah. Berserker goes brr. we've seen it. It's a really good class to try to solo the game. I've seen playtesters attempt that. It's incredible to watch. At your own discretion, though. Not advised on your first playthrough, but it's something that I've seen people attempt.
So let's delve into the fighter. This is it's a martial class. It's kind of the expert with weapons.
Well, fighters are surprisingly versatile. So it sounds like, hey, fighter is probably gonna just smack some people, but because the subclasses of fighter have pretty interesting customization. Battle Master has these maneuvers that give them very wide range of options of what to do with enemies. They can goad an enemy and make them attack you. You can fear an enemy. Battle Master has that. Eldritch Knight doubles in spell casting. Champion doesn't have either, but Champion is a really great subclass if you are just new to D&D and you want to just jump into it without too much reading. It's probably the perfect subclass to just click Champion, Fighter, and then click Start Game. And you're going to figure out how everything will go. You're going to crit a lot. You're going to see big numbers on the screen. And then when you're going to be ready for more customization, that's when a lot of the magic items that we put in the game are going to start coming in. And then fighters, because they can wear any armor and they can use any weapon with proficiency, they are the most flexible of the martial classes. You can mix and match any features and passives and interesting magical effects that you can find on different pieces of equipment. With a fighter, that's the easiest thing to just put a bunch of loot in one big box and look at it and go like, okay, what can I build from this? How can I make it more than the sum of its parts?
That brings us to the rogue. I like rogues quite a bit. What is your advice in terms of if you're playing D&D or Baldur's Gate 3? We've got Arcane Trickster, we've got the Assassin, we've got the Thief.
Rogue is kind of a staple in a D&D party. I would say that your party probably needs a rogue or somebody who is going to be very much like rogue. So rogues are great at skill checks, and there's a lot of skill checks. There is quite a bit of crime to be had if you fancy that. There's a lot of stuff to steal, a lot of pockets to pick, a lot of locks to pick, a lot of traps to disarm. It's really handy to have a rogue with some tools on hand, and rogues are really good at stealth. You can sneak around in Baldur's Gate 3, kind of dodge enemies, side cones, weave in and out of stealth, even in combat. So that's something that we offer to the players, is to use hide action in combat. It's going to be a little bit challenging. You'll have to really hide first. And then enemies will still know that, hey, there was somebody who who is trying to hide there. I need to go and check out that corner. But with some careful positioning, with some maybe teleportation tricks, if you have any, you'll be able to hide in combat and then jump on the enemy again, which is really great for Assassin, which is the new subclass for release. And that's a subclass that is all about jumping on an enemy, having that first attack, surprising the enemy. It's very fun. It's like playing a cat, basically. You're in ambush half the time, and then you jump on people.
Do a whole bunch of damage very quickly. Arcane Trickster is very handy. The Mage Hand, being able to like manipulate items from a distance.
Yes. It took us a lot of surprising amount of work, but we finally are going to allow Mage Hand at release to press buttons, push levers, and do little interactions. The reason why it took us so much work is that a lot of buttons and a lot of levers start dialogues or activate traps or start situations. So we had to basically go through all of them and say like, okay, but what if the person touching the button is not a player, but is actually their mage hand? What happens?
These classes, these subclasses kind of invite things that you need to do within the game to make those satisfying, including, like you just mentioned with Arcane Trickster, being able to like click those levers, be able to maybe pick a pocket from a distance, that kind of thing, interact with the environment. With Bard, you can play songs. Like you suddenly have to realize the music, whereas we may not actually sing around the table when we're playing Dungeons and Dragons or play an actual lute. You had to include instruments and lute, and actual songs that can be played, right?
Yes, absolutely. That was another kind of crazy feature that is a minor miracle that it was all created. I'm still really impressed every time it happens. But basically in Baldur's Gate 3, you have multiple musical instruments that you can pick, like flute, violin, lyre. And if you're a bard, or if you're somebody who has the performer feat, so we wanted to make other players be able to do this as well, but bards just do it for free, obviously. They're really good at it. You can play the instrument and you can pick the song you're trying to play. And what you're going to hear is just going to be just your instrument going through the melody. But then if you have a second bard in your party or somebody who's good with another musical instrument, you can play together and you're going to hear both instruments together. If you don't have an instrument handy, which is possible, you're kind of abandoned in the wilderness, your character will actually whistle. So bards can also whistle even without any musical instrument. They can make some music. And if you find a bard character in the world, an NPC, they might actually join you. And there's a very prominent bard character, Alfira, who's very, very popular with our community. And we really wanted to make sure that she can join in your song and make you feel like she cares about your music. That's kind of one of the bardic special things to connect over something that is not about dealing damage, not about persuading people, but just music.
And what is your advice for playing a bard?
For bard, get into crazy situations by talking. So in Baldur's Gate 3, you can talk your way out of a lot of situations. And at release, we're also making sure that if you talk your way out of a big fight, you will be compensated in experience points so that you're not under-leveled, not underpowered, just because you're refusing to murder everything. There's a couple of fights that you will have a very hard time dodging, or you will, let's say, it's going to be very morally questionable to dodge them without spoiling anything. But bards are really good at talking their way out of situations. And the new subclass of bard we're going to add it at release is called the College of Swords bard. So these fellows, they are really good at dancing with their weapons, essentially. So their performance art is, involves a killing instrument. And it was a very interesting challenge for our animation team to take a look at all of the weapons that we support, which is a big list, and figure out like, okay, what do we do with a polearm? How do we make it into a dance? How do we make this attack feel fluid like a performance?
And then we've got the lore, we've got Valor. Lore bard is very much like, you have all those old stories, you have all this old information, and then Valor is kind of like the Skald, like the battle bard that goes into combat and kind of like hypes everyone up.
Yeah, literally. With their combat inspiration, they can make their allies a lot stronger in combat.
So we've got the Warlock, And Warlocks are always fascinating to me, and it's very well captured in Baldur's Gate 3. The different types of spells can be very specific when you look at Eldritch Blast, but you also have a patron, you have a boss, you have someone that you owe something to, and that has role-playing effects as well. We've got the Archfey, we've got the Fiend, we've got the Great Old One. What is some of your advice for playing Warlock, just both from like a mechanical way and also even in the narrative?
A Warlock is a great starter class for somebody who wants to play a caster, but doesn't want to have to read their entire spellbook every time they fight. So Warlock really constrains your choices, but gives you a lot of power. They have very few, but very hard-kicking spells. We try to make sure that those spells feel and sound great. You mentioned Eldritch Blast already. There was a lot of work that was put into making sure that you can cast Eldritch Blast 100 times over your big playthrough, and hopefully it's still gonna feel as juicy and satisfying as your first time. For Warlocks, the choice of patron is indeed very important. Something like the Archfey patron that we're adding at release is gonna be the archetype of the charming devil. Or charming Archfey, maybe. Somebody who's very good at charming people, dominating people eventually, is really good at enchantment magic. So that's kind of where their strengths lie. One of our origins is a patron, and you're gonna see their a warlock, and you're gonna see their patron a lot. Whether you will like that patron or you might fight with them, I don't know. But some of my most favorite dialogues are actually this warlock will interacting with their patron. It's a lot of snark and a lot of humor.
And then you've got the Great Old One as well. Were there any other interesting things about the mechanics for the Great Old One, the Fiend?
The Great Old One is really more of an eldritch monstrosity kind of stuff. There is necrotic damage, cold damage, tentacles rising from the ground to grasp your enemies. It's pretty horrorish, actually. Very interesting. And then the Fiend is the third subclass for the Warlock, the third patron. That one is predictably all about the hot fires of hell.
So we got the Cleric, and this is when we get a lot of subclasses, because in D&D there are a lot of subclasses for Cleric. We've got Knowledge, Life, Light, we got Nature, Tempest, Trickery, War. We don't need to get into all these subclasses, but what is some of your advice specific to Clerics, and also what's surprising about Clerics in D&D?
A really cool thing about Clerics that is unique to them in Baldur's Gate 3 is that they can pick a deity that they're following. And whether their deity is evil deity or a good deity is going to be coming up a lot in dialogues. So as a cleric, your dialogue choices are going to be influenced by your deity primarily. This is kind of something special from your class. It's really satisfying to have a really evil playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 if you're a cleric of a really evil god. You have a lot of interesting things that you can say to people. On the mechanical side, clerics are probably neck and neck with wizards in terms of how varied and how flexible they are as casters. They have a lot of spells that they can do. Of course, they focus on healing and buffing their allies, but they're packing a serious punch as well. So you're not gonna have any issues with damage if your party has a cleric. They have a lot of radiant spells, which is great because you're gonna be seeing a lot of undead who are vulnerable to radiant damage. So you're gonna be really happy you have a cleric on your team. And then in terms of the subclass, clerics can really dabble into anything they want. So there's a really dedicated healer kind of archetype, which is Life Cleric. There's dedicated I'm gonna smash some people archetype, which is the War Cleric. Clerics are really great if you want to combine a bit of armor, a bit of martial capability with very strong spellcasting side.
That brings us to the Druid. The Druid is very interesting because they have Wild Shape, and you cover the different subclasses like Moon, Land, and then Spores, which thematically is very dark and kind of creepy and of the moment. What is your best advice mechanically for playing a Druid in Baldur's Gate 3 and D&D? And also, what was most surprising about what came out of these subclasses?
Druid was our first big class that we put out in the patch after the early access launch of Baldur's Gate 3. So we were trying very hard to make a good impression. That means we put a lot of effort into what your wild shapes can do, even in terms of just like sitting on benches and lying down. but also making sure that every wild shape has interesting actions that they can use. For release, we're also trying to make sure that your wild shape catches up in power with something like a barbarian who is decked out with legendary weapon and like incredible loot that you can find in the game. So we really try to make sure that wild shapes don't drop off in power anymore into the end game, that you can use all of them as much as you want. And that makes the toolkit of the Druid kind of very diverse as well. You can turn into a raven, you can fly to another part of the battlefield, you can turn into a bear, roar at enemies, make sure that they attack you and not your teammates. And if stuff is not going according to plan, you turn into a badger and you burrow your way out of your problem. There are some new shapes. I'm really happy that we found time to add the Dilophosaurus because I really wanted a dinosaur in this game. And then for the new subclass that we're adding at release, one look at Spore Druid, and I knew that we're going to have to pick this one. It's just this wonderfully icky, slightly horrorish vibe to Druid, which is still very much in line with them being centered around nature and what is the natural cycle of things. It's kind of a reminder that besides growth, there's also decay in the cycle of nature, and all of it is still natural to a Druid, and they can draw power both from growth, but also from very much actively decaying bodies that turn into zombies. As much as it sounds like necromancy, this is completely natural, kids.
No, that's perfect. I love their inclusion in this, and that the video looks fantastic. When it comes to the Ranger, what is your advice, mechanically and narratively in terms of playing Baldur's Gate 3 and D&D? Who is the Ranger for?
Oh, Ranger is, there's a great debate inside me. If I'm going to play Ranger, I don't know if I'm going to pick Beastmaster because I love their pets. For release, we're also making sure that the pet is growing in power with you so that they're keeping up with what you can do. And they're also changing visually, and even their name is changing because we realize that the player across these tons of hours that you're going to be playing the game, the player has a lot of opportunities to customize how they look, what they're wearing, what paint they put on their equipment, what their weapons are. But the pet kind of always was staying the same. So we really wanted the pet to also change so that you feel that, okay, my overall power is increasing. So that one is just my favorite just because I like their pets. But the new subclass that we're adding is the Gloomstalker, which is really great if you want to sneak and shoot. And then the first subclass is Hunter, of course. Hunter is also very interesting because something unique to D&D, I think, is that D&D allows Rangers, or like this Hunter archetype, to stand their ground in both melee and ranged. You can totally make a melee dexterity-based combatant out of a Ranger, and Hunter is a way to do this. They have features that allow them to both have a whirlwind that attacks all the enemies in melee, and then also shoot at enemies at range. So they can really combine these two hunts.
That brings us to the Sorcerer. I'm very excited because I have been playing Wild Magic since 2nd edition. So having that Wild Magic table suddenly included in Baldur's Gate 3 and having that Wild Magic surge happen automatically is so fun. And tell me about the different origins we have for the Sorcerers and your advice for playing each of them in the game and how it kind of influences, like some of these even influence your look while you're playing the game.
Oh yeah, indeed. So the one I think that most players are familiar with is the Wild Magic Sorcerer. It's a sorcerer whose source of power is the chaos of the multiverse. They are going to create these magic surges when they cast, or at will eventually. And the cool thing about that is that it's kind of a third side to any combat. If you see that combat is not going very well, you can always create a magic surge and see, like, here's a new element that came in. Hey, all of the spells will heal anybody that they hit. These kind of random magic surges, they're giving you opportunities and threats that you can turn to your advantage. You can go like, oh, look, now suddenly my sorcerer is the best healer in my party because a surge happened. Suddenly they're healing out everybody. Or, hey, I'm going to swap with a key enemy target because a surge happened and I can swap with anything on the screen right now. It's a really reactive playstyle. and with a big variety of spells that sorcerers can have, which covers, like, it's a big overlap with wizards. It covers a lot of spells in the game. They can have a lot of cool combos, honestly.
And they can manipulate the spells as well, right? You can, like,
yes,
with the meta magic options.
With the meta magic, that's another unique thing about sorcerers. So they can duplicate a spell, or they can increase its range, or they can increase its duration, or they can make a spell subtle, so not attracting attention. Which is really powerful if you have a knock spell available somewhere. That is wild magic. We also have Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer, which is proudly presenting their Draconic ancestor with scales that you can see and you can customize in the character creation. If you're a Dragonborn Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer, you have access to this, like, completely unique dual tone Dragonborn skin that was just made specifically for this combination, because we wanted to make sure that we cover it with something unique. And then they're gonna kind of tap into this Draconic ancestry and get powers from their ancestral dragons that depend on the color or the metallic sheen of the Draconic bloodline. So let's say if your grandpa was a red dragon, you might have fire-related powers and resistances. And the new sorcerer class is Storm Sorcery. So if you know X-Men, there is Storm in X-Men, that's Storm Sorcerer for sure. The really neat thing that they can do, and they can do this from level 1, is they can fly right after casting a spell. So if you see a chest somewhere on a cliff that you can't normally jump to, or you spotted a ledge that you can jump to and maybe there's a hidden door there, Storm Sorcery is really great in that. In like this exploration aspect, this like short little fly that you can do opens a lot of doors.
So that brings us to the monk. We've got a variety of subclasses. We have open hand, we've got shadow, we've got 4 elements. What is your advice for D&D players and Baldur's Gate 3 players? Who is the monk most geared towards? How to have fun with that mechanically and even narratively?
Monk is great if you want to be running around the battlefield, if you want to be striking where nobody is expecting you. Also, if you want to be able to really calm down a situation. So the interesting thing with monks, any class has special dialogue options when they're conversing with other NPCs. And for monk, the dialogue options really center on the concept of Zen, the concept of meditation. Monks are great at disarming the hostile NPCs with just a few words, at like lowering the temperature of hostility in the room. So that's when you really need a monk. And mechanically, monks are, of course, mostly about their unarmed attacks. They're masters of their own body. You're going to look great as you're unarmed attacking. Our animation team has been working with martial artists to mock up actual Kung Fu stances and moves. You might actually recognize some of them from popular movies that you've seen if you're into Kung Fu movies. Open Hand Monk is the subclass that is most focused on just the variety of different attacks that you can do without any weapons. You can stun people, you can tap into the key energy in their bodies to explode them later, and to make sure that they can also go head-to-head with that proverbial barbarian with a really big axe. We made sure that monks will find magic equipment that is going to synergize well with their unarmed attacks, and also with dashing, with jumping, with doing things that feel monk-like. So there's going to be magic gloves that are going to empower you on unarmed attacks to make sure that you're still up there in utility in a fight.
Yeah, so tell me about the Way of Shadow, because these are very, very, very tricky, very good at just bamfing around combat.
Way of Shadow is basically a ninja. It's a ninja on steroids. The really cool thing they can do, they can teleport from shadow to shadow, which is pretty unique and pretty powerful because, in a city, there's shadows everywhere. Next to every building, next to every lamppost, there's a bit of shadow. So as a shadow monk, you can just jump from one place to another. Let's say if you need to stage a heist into a bank, that place is going to be full of shadows.
Yeah.
So take it as you will. And then final subclass is the 4 elements monk. This is, if you've seen the Avatar animated series, you're going to be very familiar. Like, that's the mental picture of how 4 elements monk work. They create this Hadouken spells, harnessing elemental powers. We also tweaked the key economy a little bit at higher levels to make sure that you never run out of juice as a monk. As long as you're resting properly, as long as you're not pushing too many fights without resting, you should have access to most of your kit in most of the situations.
That brings us to Paladin. This is a much beloved class and subclasses that's in D&D and Baldur's Gate 3. We've got the Ancients, we've got Devotion, we've got Vengeance, and Oathbreaker, which is a narrative-based subclass. Tell me all about, like, what's your advice for playing a Paladin? What's exciting about all these subclasses and what you've done narratively?
So Paladin is all about their oath, the oath that they swear. The oath of devotion is going to be the oath to protect the innocent, and well, there's going to be a lot of innocence. Let's put it this way. It's the quintessential knight in shining armor. It's the person who wants to hug their entire group and cover them in aura and probably will heal them at it. The Vengeance Paladin is the new subclass that we're putting into the release. That one is hell-bent on vengeance. They're pretty angry. And actually, very interestingly, as a paladin, you can break your oath. You need to be very careful about what you say and what you do, because your oath is very much for real. We are keeping track of things. And for Vengeance Paladin, the way to break your oath is to let the evil go unpunished. So in a lot of situations, it might feel like, hey, I'm just not gonna say anything in the situation. It might be dangerous for me to speak out right now. But for a paladin, that's going to be breaking their oath. They're out there to make sure that there is restorative justice that's going to happen. And finally, there's Ancients. The Oath of Ancients is all about protecting the nature. Paladins of that oath are a little closer to Druids, and they understand nature and understand the desire to protect it from meddling, from pollution very strongly, which is great because we have a huge storyline about Druids in Act 1, and then a huge storyline about nature being cursed and destroyed and polluted in Act 2. So there's a lot of kind of juicy narrative content to get into as an Oath of Ancients Paladin. If your oath gets broken, you will become the Oathbreaker Paladin. It's going to be the most subversive of all of these, of all 4 of these. It's going to be probably the preferred choice for somebody who wants to really lean into an evil playthrough. And an interesting thing about Oathbreaker is that we also have a feature that allows you to reset your character and restart their class, because we wanted you to continue your playthrough no matter what. We know that there's a lot of big choices that you need to make at early levels in D&D. And we know that a lot of players will kind of jump in blindly and just try things out. And so if things don't work out, there's a very powerful being that you can talk to that is going to help you to reset your class and reallocate all of the levels. But then we realized, like, hey, are we just gonna allow players to like respec out of being an Oathbreaker? Which, of course, we can't possibly do. So you have to atone for your sins before you can respec. That's the only subclass that cannot just go and change their mind, like restart. They will have to do some work towards that.
Last but not least, we have the Wizard. We've got a lot of subclasses here. We've got Abjuration, Conjuration, Divination, Enchantment, Evocation, Necromancy, Illusion, and Transmutation. So we don't have to go into every single subclass, but tell me what was challenging about creating the Wizard? What's your advice for playing a Wizard in Baldur's Gate 3 and D&D?
Wizards have access to most of the spells in the game, except the tiny exception of Bard, who can just steal spells, but doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But anyway, on paper, wizards are the most versatile of casters. You'll probably have the biggest hotbar full of spells. You will be able to pick up scrolls in loot and buy them from vendors and learn them, kind of memorize them, and be able to cast these spells forever. since wizards are so in tune with magic, with how magic works, their subclasses are actually each corresponds to a school of magic. My favorite one, and one that I enjoy the most, is divination, which was quite challenging to create technically for us. But the way we are adapting divination is that when you rest, you have a bit of a omen, a premonition, which allows you to roll 2d20s and save the results for later. And maybe one of those d20s is going to be a high roll, maybe one of them is going to be a low roll. You will be able to replace rolls going forward with these dice. So you, if you're in a tight situation in combat and you really, really need a crit, but hey, you predicted that somebody is going to roll a d20, you're going to put that portent d20 dice and say like, now I'm going to crit. I foresaw this. I had a dream about this. Or if you really need an enemy to miss you, you can always go like, hey, you just rolled a 2 because I foresaw this when I was sleeping last time.
Divination is probably one of my favorite wizards as well. I'm very in evocation. I have to bring up just because my wife Megan loves evocation wizards and just blasting enemies to cinders. It's definitely the most blasty of all the wizards, the most glass cannon. How do you handle illusion magic and illusionists and necromancy as wizards?
Necromancy is fun because we wanted the player to have a little necromantic army. That's kind of the stereotype, is having a lot of buddies that are less than fully alive. So the necromancy wizard will be able to raise additional undead, and their undead are going to be a bit beefier as well. This paired with some high-level necromancy spells will allow you to have quite a few necromantic minions, and also different kinds of mummies, ghouls, zombies. There's also some very rare magic tomes that are going to allow you to summon even more undead characters in the city. So check it out. Try to make the zombie apocalypse happen. I've seen some stuff. Let's put it this way.
And for like illusion magic, like, how does that work in Baldur's Gate 3?
The illusions are tough, and we leaned into our crime system with illusions. The illusion is something that you can use to distract guards. Illusion magic is really great if you're not trying to get into trouble right now. If you're trying to sneak around, maybe you're going to be a sneaky wizard. So this is great when you can create minor illusions faster than any other class, and kind of manipulate guard behavior, manipulate NPCs. In a city, it's really useful to be able to tell, to make a big crowd look away. That comes in very handy.